Sea legends, tragic love, enchanters, and smugglers. If you wake at midnight and you hear a horse's feet, don't go drawing back the blind or looking in the street. Them that asks no questions isn't told a lie. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by. 5 and 20 ponies trotting through the dark, brandy for the parson, baccy for the clerk. Lacy's for a lady, letters for a spy. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by. Running round the woodpile, if you chance to find little barrels roped and tarred all full of brandy wine, don't just shout to come and look, nor use them for your play. Put the brushwood back again, and they'll be gone the next day. 5 and 20 ponies trotting through the dark, brandy for the parson, baccy for the clerk. Lacy's for the lady, letters for a spy. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by. If you see the stable door set and open wide, if you see a tired horse lying down inside, if your mother mends a coat about and tore, the lining's wet and warm, don't you ask no more. If you meet King George's men, dressed in blue and red, you be careful what you say and mindful what is said. If they call you pretty maid and chuck you neath the chin, don't you tell where no one is, nor yet where no one's been. If you do as you've been told, likely there's a chance you'll be given a dainty doll all the way from France, with a cap of pretty lace and a velvet hood, a present from the gentleman along o' being good. 5 and 20 ponies trotting through the dark, brandy for the parson, baccy for the clerk. Lacy's for a lady, letters for a spy. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by. And that's a smuggler's song from Rudyard Kipling. Cornish Lullaby. Hush, my little ugling, Daddy's gone a smuggling, he's gone off to Roscoff. In the mega VC Mead, a sloop of 90 tons and 10 brass carriage guns to teach the kingship's mariners and respect for honest trade. Sleep, my joy and sorrow, Daddy'll come tomorrow, bringing baccy, tea and snuff and brandy home from France. He'll bring the goods ashore while the old collectors snore and the black dragooners gamble in the dens of old Penzance. Rock-a-bye, my honey, for Daddy's making money. You shall be a gentleman and sail with privateers, with a silver cup on your sack, a blue coat upon your black, and diamonds on your finger bones and gold rings in your ears. So, what is a smuggler? Now, that's an important question, I think, and goes to explaining why we have such a fascination with smugglers and pirates. Were they not bloodthirsty curs with no morals or ethics? Well, in a sense, maybe. Sometimes. Certainly none of them were lawyers. But the real definition of a smuggler lays any blame for that squarely on the shoulders of kings and governments and laws, leaving the smugglers as innocent as Robin Hood, or even the music and movie pirates of pop modern day. You'll hear the speech of fair trade, honest trade. Ah, these smugglers, they did follow rules, guidelines really, and did practice fair trade. The unfairness of trade in these days, and one could argue modern days as well, was onerous taxes imposed on each trading transaction by kings and governments who, often as not, had no legitimate part in the trade that had taken place. Smugglers were brave men and women bent on doing what was right, supporting their families, and perhaps drawing a bit of profit from same. So, definition of a smuggler then is a person who, though no doubt highly blamable for violating the laws of his country, is frequently incapable of violating the laws of natural justice, and who would have been, in every respect, an excellent citizen had not the laws of his country made that a crime which nature never meant to be so. The Smugglers of Penrose. In winter's tedious nights, sit by the fire with good old folks and let them tell thee tales of woeful ages long ago betide. Now what remains of the old mansion of Penrose in Sennin stands on a low and lonely site at the head of a narrow valley, through which a mill brook winds, with many abrupt turns, for about 3 miles, thence to Penberth Cove. Though so late as maybe 40 years ago, it was one of those antique and mysterious-looking buildings which most persons regard with a degree of interest that no modern structure inspires. The upper story only, with its mullioned windows, pointed gables, and massive chimney stacks, was just seen over the ivy-covered walls of courts and gardens that surrounded it. Now, there was, however, a certain... The rum is gone? Oh no, why is the rum gone? Actually, I think there's a few barrels on the ghost ship over there. There was, however, a certain gloomy air about the ruinous walls and the neglected gardens embowered in aged trees, which might have conduced to such unaccountable stories of apparitions and other unnatural occurrences as were said to have taken place there. Now, some 3 or 4 centuries ago, it was the property and residence of an ancient family of the same name. A little more is known of these old Penroses than what can be gathered from wild traditions related by the Winter's Hearth. The following, among many others, were often recounted by the old folks of the West. About 300 years ago, the owner of Penrose was a younger son who had been brought up to a seafaring life, which he continued to follow till his older brothers died unmarried and left him heir to the family estate. And then, preferring a life on the wave, he kept a well-armed and fast-sailing craft for fair trading, or what is now called smuggling. Aye, that ship, she was manned with as brave a crew as could be picked out of the West Country. Most of them are said to have been the squire's poor relations. A favourite cousin called William Penrose, who had been his shipmate for years, was captain of the merry men all. The squire often took trips to France and other places once his goods were brought. It is said that in the days Penrose crew were never concerned in any practical jobs, though we know about that time smuggler, privateer, and pirate meant very much the same thing, whilst the two latter were then convertible terms with most of the rovers on the deep. Now Penrose and his seamen passed but little time on shore except in the depth of winter, but yet the board in his hall was always furnished with good substantial fare and the best of liquors, free for all comers. Over a few years, when the good man was left a widower with an only child, a boy about 7 or 8, he seemed to dislike the very sight of land. But then, even in winter, with his little son, his cousin William, and 2 or 3 old sailors, he would stay out at sea for weeks together, leaving, as usual, the care of his farm and household to care of a younger brother and old reeve or bailiff. That Ikran scared me too. Flashed on the screen, and I wasn't sure what the heck was that. Of course, there's drinking in Kitely. In fact, I saw Rick show up before the story, but then he never showed up over here. So I went looking for him, and there he was in the pub. And he says to me, "Yeah, where else would I be?" Or something like that. Yeah, no, there's definitely got to be drinking here. So, in returning from one of these trips on the sea in a dark winter's night, their boat struck on Cowrow and became a wreck. Now, the squire swam into Seddon Cove with his boy and, endeavouring to save his crew, got drowned himself. Now, then, the only remaining brother, known as John of Penrose, constituted himself sole guardian of the heir and master of the place and property. Now, this John hated all whom his late brother favoured, and in consequence of his ill will, William Penrose left the West Country for the sea, it was supposed, but whither he wandered was unknown, as no tidings of him were received in the West. The new master, however, soon got a large smuggling craft and manned her with a crew who cared but little what they did for gold or exciting life. Being well armed, they feared nothing that sailed the ocean. Yeah, not even an Ecrons. Now, Jean of Penrose never went to sea, but gave the command to a wretch known to have been a pirate who was cast on Gwenver sands from his ship wrecked in Whetson Bay on the night that the good Squire Penrose was drowned. Now, this pirate smuggler and his desperate crew boarded many a rich merchantman going up the channel, from which they appropriated whatsoever they pleased, and sent all who opposed them to the other world by water. Now, there was no preventative service back then to be any check on our free trade. If revenue or cutters came near our western land, their crews dreaded to fall in with Cornish fair traders more than our smugglers feared the king's men at shore. As for riding officers, they would ride anywhere else rather than on the cliff, when beacon fires blazed from the cairns of the dark nights to guide the fair traders' boats into the coves. When the rich goods and plunder were landed, and any over-curious person remarked that they were not such as seemed likely to have been purchased from our neighbours across the channel, the jolly crew would give themselves credit for being valiant privateers, and as such be much renowned by simple country folk when their plunder passed as lawful prize. People came from all over the country to purchase the goods, safely stowed in vaults and other hiding places about Penrose, and in the winter crew spent much of their time there in drunken rioting with all the reckless youngsters of the neighborhood. And I'm sure Mr. Corgan was seen there. I know I myself was. After the good squire was drowned, his brother appeared to show every kindness to the orphan. Yet it was remarked that the child seemed instinctively to avoid his uncle and the captain, who consorted much together when the smugglers were ashore. Oh, yes, and Caledonia was often there, too, in the winter hours, passing the time in the pubs. I remember. Ah, that's another story. Anyway, whenever this boy could elude the old steward's vigilance, he would go away alone to the rocks in Sennin Cove, where his father had drowned, or shut himself up for hours in his father's bedroom, or wander about other parts of the gloomy north wing, which was almost in ruins and seldom entered by other inmates. Now, one winter's day, the ground being all covered with snow, Penrose's people and many of the others in the neighborhood joined for a wolf hunt. Traditions say that in those times terrible havoc was often made on flocks by these fierce beasts, and that children were sometimes carried off by them when hard pressed with hunger. And neither John Penrose nor the captain went to the chase. When at night the game-laden hunters returned and blew their bugle horns, they remarked with surprise that the young heir, who was a general favourite, did not, as was his wont, come into the court to meet them. The boy was sought for in every place where it was thought he might have stayed. His uncle seemed to have much distressed, and continued the fruitless search until it was surmised that the child must have missed his way in returning from Sennin Cove, and perhaps wandered out under Eskel's cliff, and there maybe got drowned by the flowing tide and carried out to sea on the ebb. After this, Jean Penrose, having all his own, became more riotously debauched than ever, and his gang having taken a somewhat strange aversion to their captain, he left and was no more seen in the west. The tapestry chamber and all the northern wing was shut up here, or unoccupied, as it had the reputation of being haunted, And none of the servants, nor even the devil-may-care smugglers, would venture into it after nightfall, when unearthly shrieks would be heard there, and strange lights seen flashing through the casements till morning. Lights were also often seen in an orchard just below the town place when no one was there. Now, these unnatural occurrences, however, put no check to the excess of Penrose's band and the lawless castaways who joined them. By way of variety to their fun, they frequently disguised themselves and made nocturnal excursions to some village within a few miles, where they would alarm the quiet folks in the dead of night by discharging their firearms in a volley, and make a bonfire of furze rick, outhouse, or thatched dwelling. Now the poor villagers in their fright would mistake these wretches for outlandish people, come again to burn and pillage as in days of yore. Now the Penrose crew, at the height of the fright and confusion, would carry off such young women as they had before agreed upon. The gallants would take their fair ones before them on horseback to the Eskel's Cliff or the hills, where they would be left alone by daybreak to find their way back afoot. Having carried on this sport a long time with impunity, they became so bold at last as to make an attack on Buryan Churchtown. Fortunately, however, Buryan men were apprised of their intentions in time to be armed and ready to give them a warm reception. A warm reception indeed. In short, they lay in wait for the smugglers. They drove them all into a vacant place near the cross in Churchtown, and there surrounded them. When thus hemmed in, the band fought desperately until nearly every man of them was killed or disabled, and they continued shouting to each other, "Cheer up, comrades! Die one, die all, die we merrily!" So many of them met their end in this encounter that the Penrose band was soon after broken up. One night of the following Christmas, whilst a large company was assembled at Penrose, keeping high festival after a day's hunt, loud knocking was heard at the green court door, and soon after a servant conducted into the hall an elderly wayfaring man who requested a night's shelter from the snowstorm. Now John Penrose received the wanderer with a hospitable courtesy, and he charged his steward, the old reeve, to provide him with good cheer. The guests continued their glee and paid but little attention to him, for begging homeless pilgrims were all too plenty here at the time. Now, the company was also entertained by professional droll tellers and ballad singers. Persons of that class were then, and long continued after, be received as substitutes for minstrels in gentlemen's houses of a humbler sort. The stranger, however, regarded the company with attention, and noticed that the master of Penrose looked wretched and haggard amidst all the merriment. His scrutiny was interrupted by the steward, who conducted him to another room, where a well-furnished board besides a blazing fire awaited him. The stranger, having refreshed himself, told the steward how he had just returned from a long pilgrimage in foreign lands and had seen many places spoken of in miracle plays which were acted in a planaguar at St. Just, and how he had that morning arrived at Market Jew on board an eastern ship that traded there for tin. He also said that he once had friends in the West Country, where they were alive or dead he knew not now, but he hoped to obtain some tidings of them on the morrow. Now this wanderer's voice seemed familiar to the old steward, and he recalled from former times, but ere they had time for more discourse, they were invited to return to the hall and see a guise dance, which was about to commence. The stranger seemed interested in the quaint performance of St. George and the Turkish Knight. A droll teller in his character of bard took a part of the course, explained the intent of the coming scenes, instructed and prompted the actors as well. The play being concluded, and the gaze guards were well rewarded by the wayfarer, he withdrew and told the steward that he felt weary after a long walk through the snow and would be glad to lie down if all the beds were occupied. He could repose, he said, and settle by the fireside for a few hours only, as he intended to leave early in the morning. Now the old man replied that he feared any other accommodation in his power to offer was not such as he might desire, although the house was large, with ample bedrooms for more guests than it now contained, because a great part of the northern end was shut up for a reason that the inmates did not like to talk about. Yet as he believed the pilgrim to be a prudent man, who was no doubt learned in ghostly matters, he was glad to unburden his own mind and have his visitors counsel with his prayers for the repose of the unquiet spirits that disturbed the place. Then he told how many of the upper rooms, though well furnished, were unused and falling to ruin on account of the unnatural sounds and sights before mentioned. To which the stranger answered that he had a mind at ease, as he had no reason to dread any ghostly visitants. If the steward would conduct him to a room in the haunted wing, he did not fear for his own rest. And so the old steward, taking a lamp, led the way to the tapestry chamber, being the best room in that part of the mansion. A faggot of dry ashwood, already laid in the large open fireplace, was soon in a blaze, and the room well aired and somewhat comfortable. The old man brought in bread, meat, wine, and of course cheese, that the guest might take more refreshment during the night and supply his wallet in the morning if he started before breakfast. After returning with more wood and bog turf to keep in the fire, he bade the guest good night, sweet rest, and pleasant dreams. After the old steward had retired from the dreaded room, its occupant was in no haste to rest himself in the large, stately-looking bed, but he seemed never weary of examining the old portraits and the quaint figures in the arras, which might have been intended for portraits too. The massive oak furniture with bold, grotesque carvings, ancient armor, coats of mail, and other interesting objects which were suspended from the walls here, or in hanging presses, all of which appeared familiar, so that it was near midnight when he sat down in a long window seat. The storm had ceased, and a full moon, shining on newly fallen snow, gave a lustre of midday to objects below, and made it almost as light as day, in fact. He opened the casement and looked into the court, where he saw a company of young men and women passing out singly and in silence. This visitor, being well acquainted with West Country customs, knew, as this was Twelfth Night, that the object of this silent procession was to work some of the many spells usually practiced at this time for purpose of gaining a knowledge of their future destiny with respect to what they regarded as the most important of all events, marriage and death. They hoped to discover who would be wedded, with whom, or be buried before the new year was ended. The pilgrims had not sat long, looking out of an open casement, when he saw the company of young men and maidens come running back, apparently in great fright. The doors were all immediately slammed to, the noisy mirth and music suddenly ceased in the hall. The house, in a few moments, was shrouded in a thick fog. All was still as death about the place for some minutes. Then a noise was heard, like the distant roaring and moaning of the sea in a storm. These ocean sounds seemed to approach nearer and nearer every instant, until the waves were heard as if breaking and surging around the house. In the wailing wind was heard a noise of oars rattling in their rowlocks for another instant, then as of the casting of oars hastily into a boat. This was followed by the hollow voices of the smugglers, drowned with the old squire, hailing their own names, as drowned men's ghosts are said to do when they want the assistance of the living to procure them rest. All this time the green court appeared as if filled with the sea, and one could hear the breakers roaring as when standing on a cliff in a storm. All the buildings and trees surrounding the mansion disappeared as if sunk into the very ground. At length the surging of waves and other sounds gradually died away, until they were heard only like the calling of cleaves before a tempest. The steward had told the stranger of these noises and appearances, which had become frequent to late, to the great terror of the household. But he gave little heed to the old man's tales, thinking that such visions were merely the creations of weak brains diseased by strong potions, which is to say, they drank too much. I've been accused of that, a weak brain diseased by a strong potion. 'Tis said that when young folk reached the outer gate of the avenue, near which they would find the plants required for their spells, all keeping silence and taking care not to look behind them, as is this or speaking would spoil the charm, a female who was a short distance ahead of them saw what appeared to be in the sea coming over the moors before a driving fog. She ran shrieking to join her companions, who also beheld the waves fast approaching, rolling and curling and breaking on the heath. They all ran up to the house with their utmost speed, and some who had the courage to look behind when near the court door saw the curling breakers within a few yards of them, and a boat, manned with a ghostly crew, came out of the driving mist as they rushed into the house, and not daring to look out, they saw nothing more. Now the weary wayfaring man, having a clear conscience, feared nothing evil in what appeared to him an unaccountable mystery, even in that time of marvels, and having told his beads, he committed himself to a good spirit's care. Now the brave man was rather soothed than alarmed by a plaintive melody, until there was a change in the harmonious strains, which grew more distinct, and mingled with them were the tones of loved once and familiar voices calling, "William Penrose, arise and avenge the murder of thy cousin's son." William Penrose, arise and avenge the murder of thy cousin's son. Now, casting a glance towards the window whence the sound proceeded, he saw just within it the apparition of a beautiful boy in white raiment. A light which surrounded it showed the countenance of the lost heir of Penrose. At the same time, the room was filled with a fragrance like that of sweet spring flowers. Now the pilgrim, William Penrose, spoke to the spirit and conjured it, according to the form prescribed by the Holy Church, to speak and say what he should do to give it rest. The apparition, coming nearer, told how he had been murdered by the pirate captain of the smugglers on the grand hunting day, and how his uncle had given the pirate a great quantity of gold to do that bloody deed, and that he had been buried in the orchard under an apple tree that would be known even in winter by its blasted appearance, that the murderer was then, right now, in Plymouth, keeping public house, the situation which was so plainly described by the spirit that William Penrose would have no difficulty in finding it, and bringing the murderer to justice by means of such proofs of his crime as he would be found beneath the blasted tree. Moreover, the spirit told William that spirits knew he was gone on a pilgrimage for their repose, and that they all, through him, sought his aid to enable them to rest in peace. So William Penrose, having promised to perform all according to the wishes of the departed, music was again heard, and the spirit gradually disappeared in a cloud of light. Then the weary man sunk into sound repose, which he only awoke at the break of day. So his cousin, the good squire, had also appeared to him in a dream, and told him that concealed in the wainscot, beneath a certain piece of tapestry, he would find a secret cabinet, in which was preserved a good store of gold and jewels for the infant heir, and that the key of this hidden treasury was behind a leaf of carved foliage which ornamented the bedhead. He was told to take what money he required for his journey and to keep the key. He found everything as indicated in his dream. Now, Jean of Penrose had often sought for this private recess, where heirlooms and other valuables were concealed, and only made known to the heir when of age, or to a trusty guardian if a minor. But he was deterred from further search by such an apparition as made him avoid the chamber. So the pilgrim arose and requested the old steward to accompany him a short distance on his journey. Before they departed, the stranger discovered himself, to the old man's great delight, to be the long-lamented William Penrose, told him that he was about to undertake a long journey for the repose of the dead, and that he would return when he had accomplished his mission, and bade the steward adieu, without speaking of the apparition or the cause of the disturbance in the mansion. So our William Penrose, having now arrived in the ancient town of Plymouth, and entered the mean public house to which he had been directed by the apparition, he saw the person he sought lying stretched by the fireside in a squalid apartment that served for kitchen, guest chamber, and sleeping room. The former pirate captain looked like a deserter from the churchyard, as we say. The face of this child murderer was color of one long in the tomb, but with little signs of life except in the lurid glare of his sunken eyes. And what would you expect of a child murderer? William Penrose, with much difficulty, induced the wished-looking object to converse, and after a while led him to the talk of West Country than of Sennin. From that the pilgrim spoke of Penrose, and asked him if he knew in a Penrose orchard a certain apple tree which he pointedly described. He had no sooner mentioned it than the innkeeper exclaimed, "I am a dead man." Yes, the miserable wretch begged the pilgrim to have mercy on him, and listened to his confession, in which he declared he was driven to commit the murder by his evil spirit that made him dislike the child, because he had long hated his parents more than from any love of gold given him by John of Penrose, to remove the only obstacle to his possession of the estate. Now our William Penrose, who was still unknown to the innkeeper, wondered what cause of ill will he could ever have had against the good squire or his wife, until the former pirate told how he was the prodigal son, long supposed dead, of an ancient, respectable, but poor family, whose ancestral seat was within few miles of Penrose; how almost from his childhood he had long and truly loved, as he trusted had his love returned, by the lady who became the wife of Squire Penrose; how that he had left his home in St. Just on a desperate privateering expedition, in hopes of soon gaining sufficient riches to make the lady's parents regard him with favour; how, whilst he was returning with gold enough to buy the parish, Penrose had wooed and won the lady, his first and only love, for whom he had toiled and suffered every hardship during many years. William also related how he came home so altered by the burning suns of the Spanish Main, that his nearest relatives knew him not, and found out the ill return his lady love had made him, that his only solace was the hope of revenge. Now some of the gold that he had sweat blood to gain for the sake of the faithless fair lady was laid out in a fast-sailing craft which might pass for a merchantman, a privateer, or a pirate, as she was all in turn during a few years they roamed the British seas. His vessel was manned with a desperate crew, most of them his old comrades who would do anything to please him. The design he had formed, more through hate than love, was to carry the lady off to some foreign land. Now, a year or so after his return, he landed one night in Whitsun Bay, accompanied by a great part of his well-armed crew, who took their way towards Penrose, where he learned ere their arrival that his design of carrying off the lady was frustrated by her having been laid in the grave a few days before. After this he wandered over sea and land by turns, caring nothing what became of him, until cast on Gwenvor sands, poor and naked as a ship foundered in the deep water, when all but himself were drowned, and as bad luck would have it, he reached the shore on some loose part of the wreck. Now, the worst portion of his story from this time is already told, but no one can tell, as he related how the desire of gold to enable him to recommence his roving life far away from the hated side of land, and everything else that recalled a remembrance of his blighted youthful hopes, maddening drink, a wicked heart, farther irritated by John Penrose, made him murder that child that he would have given 100 lives to restore before he received the uncle's bloody gold. Since then he had never a moment been free from remorse. He wished for death, he said, but feared to die. If he drank himself mad, that only increased the horror of his own thoughts. But he had scarcely finished his sad tale when William Penrose discovered himself to be the well-remembered playmate of the wretched man's innocent youth, and he had only time to beg Penrose to bestow on him alms his ill-got sore, for the scarcely hoped-for mitigation of future punishment. William Penrose returned to Penrose Manor, made himself known to the great joy of old servants and others. No one either loved, feared, or cared enough about John Penrose, surly man that he was, to pay him any regard. He was absent then in one of his melancholy moods, and William, with the steward, aided by other trusty old servants, removed the child's remains from beneath the blasted tree to Sennin churchyard, and out of respect for the honourable family, was little said known about the sad occurrence. Now John of Penrose was no more seen alive in the old mansion, for the same night that his nephew's remains were buried in consecrated ground, he hanged himself in the malt house, and he haunted it long after. Following the spirit's injunction, William Penrose had still to find and remove the bodies of the old squire and his crew. Now it was supposed that they were sanded, that is, sunk in the moist sand and covered by it during flowing tide near Gwenver Cove, because the corpse lights had frequently been seen, and the drowned sailors had been heard there hailing their own names, as they were still accustomed to do on requiring aid of the living. And so the next day Penrose and others found the bodies of the old sailor squire and his crew near that place where the fishermen had heard calling of the dead, and the remains were laid to repose with all holy rites in an ancient burying ground near Chapel Idne, where the wind and waves sing their everlasting requiem in music they loved well when alive. A tale of the smugglers of Penrose. And now I think, a love story of the sea, although perhaps It, too, is a tragic love story. It does have a happy ending, more or less. My William's love was heaven on earth. Without it, earth is hell. Legend of Pargwara. Proceeding westward from St. Levan's Well, we pass the next inlet called Parladon, Wide Cove, and arrive at Pargwara, the Higher Cove, which is one of the most secluded and picturesque nooks that may anywhere be found. The old folks also called this place Sweetheart's Cove, from tradition of its having been the scene of a tragical love story. The tragedy of Sweet William and Fair Nancy. Now, this composition of a forgotten western bard related that far back in old times, the son of a fisherman who dwelt at Pargwara lived many years, off and on from a boy, in service with a rich farmer in Roscastle, and courted his master's only daughter, who, almost from her childhood, loved the young serving man with a strength of affection beyond her control. Now, this youngster, being of a roving turn, often went to sea for many months in summer, and although he was then most wanted on the farm, his masters always took him back again when sailors were paid off and merchant ships laid up during the stormy winter season. It was his old master's and Nancy's great delight of a winter's nights to be seated with neighbours around the fire and hear Willie tell of strange things he had beheld on the ocean and foreign lands. They wondered at what he related of waterspouts and icebergs and northern lights and whales and seals and Laplanders. They listened with awe and surprise to what he told them of burning mountains where he had seen from a distance the very mouths of hell vomiting clouds of sulphurous smoke and flames and rivers of fire. While sailing as near these dreadful regions as anyone dared venture for the heat, and for fear of having their vessel drawn ashore, where all the nails would be pulled from her planks by the lodestone rocks that bordered these lands. Of nights he had heard high above devils shouting, "The time is come, but such and such one isn't come." Soon after, one would hear doleful cries, and behold black clouds of doomed spirits driven to the burning mountains by troops of demons. He had seen the wreck of Pharaoh's chariots on the beach of the Red Sea, which he assured them had retained the hue for which it took its name ever since the Egyptian hosts were slain and overwhelmed, where their bones were still bleaching on the sands. But all that was easily believed by his simple hearers, and mere nothing to the marvels he related from shipmates' stories when he told them of bold mariners who had been farther east and seen dead seas across which no bird could fly, how they had plucked from the trees that bordered its black waters apples full of ashes that were tempting to the eye. They touched Lot's wife turned to salt. They'd brought home some of her fingers that was often done, he said, with the next tide's flow they sprouted out again. The neighbours liked above all to hear him tell about the dusky men and strange women of Levantine lands, how the latter would shoot loving glances at British tars through peepholes cut in their thick black cloth veils. Now William himself, Willie, was a wonder of perfection, past compare in fair Nancy's eyes. She admired him for his stalwart form, for his strange adventures on sea and land, and for the rare presents he brought her home. The farmer, too, liked him just as if he had been his own son. Yet it never entered his head that his daughter and only child would ever think of the dashing and careless young seaman as her lover. Yet her mother, more sharp-sighted, soon discovered that her fair Nancy was very much in love with their serving-man. When William was gone to sea, the dame upbraided her with want of proper pride and self-respect till she had fretted her almost to death's door. "What a fool thou must be," she would say, "to throw thyself away, or to hanker after one so much beneath thy degree, when thy good looks and dower make thee a match for the richest farmer's son in the West Country. Think, if you wed a poor sailor, how you'll be scorned by all your kith and kin." And Nancy replied, "But little I care for relations, approach, or good will, or sink or swim. If I ever marry, it shall be for the man I love, who's able to work and win." And so the dame prevailed on her husband, much against his will, however, not to take the sailor to live there when he returned home again. And she, watching her opportunity, slammed the door in his face and told him he should never more harbour beneath her roof. But the father, fearing his only child would pine to her death, told her and her lover that if he would try his fortune by a voyage to the Indies or elsewhere for 3 years, when he returned, poor or rich, if he and Nancy were in the same mind, that they might be wedded for all he cared. And that being agreed upon, William got a berth in a merchantman bound for a long voyage. He took friendly leave of his old master, and the night before his ship was ready to sail, he and Nancy met, and he assured the sorrowing damsel that in 3 years, or less, she might expect him to land in Pargwara, with plenty of riches, and he would marry at home or fetch her away and make her his bride. According to the old verses, he said, "Down in the valley, love, where this three streams unite, I build thee a castle of ivory and diamonds so bright, that shall be a guide for poor sailors of a dark and stormy night." And so Willie and Nancy vowed again and again to be constant and true. With their hands joined in a living spring or stream, they broke a gold ring in two between them, each one keeping apart. And to make their vows more binding, they kindled at dead of night a fire on Garagazans, the holy rock, which then stood in Roskestel town place. And joining their hands over the flame, they called on all the powers of heaven and earth to witness their solemn oaths to have each other living or dead. Having plighted their troth with these and other ancient rites that romantic lovers of old regarded as more sacred than a marriage ceremony, they said farewell, and William went on his way and joined the ship. Now 3 years passed, during which the old dame had done her utmost to persuade her daughter to become the wife of some rich farmer, for true it was, as she said, Nancy might have had her choice of the best, yet coaxing and reproaches were powerless to shake the maid's constancy. When 3 years and many months were gone without any tidings of William, she became very melancholy, perhaps crazy, from hope deferred, and took to wandering about the Cleeves and Wall in all weathers, by day and by night. On the headland, called Hella Point, which stretches far out west of the cove, there's a high overhanging rock almost on the verge of the cliff, which shelters on its rather on its southern side, a patch of green sward, mostly composed of cliff pinks. This spot used to be known as Fair Nancy's bed. There she would pass hours by day and often whole nights watching vessels that came within her ken, hoping to see her lover land from every one that hove in sight, and be the first to hail him with joyful greetings in the cove. Her father and the old fisherman, anxious for William's return, treated her as tenderly as a shorn lamb, and often passed long nights with her there. At length the poor maiden had to be watched and followed for fear that in her night wanderings she might fall over the cliff and drown herself in a fit of despair. One moonlight winter's night, when in her chamber, indulging her grief, she heard William's voice just under her window, saying, "Sleepest thou, sweetheart? Awaken and come hither, love. My boat awaits us at the cove. Thou must come this night, or never be my bride." "My sweet William, come at last. I'll be with thee in an instant." And Nancy's Aunt Prudence, who lodged in the same room, heard Willie's request and his sweetheart's answer. Looking out the window, she saw the sailor, just under, dripping wet and deathly pale. An instant after, glancing around into the chamber and seeing Nancy leave it, she dressed in all haste and followed her. Now Aunt Prudence, running down the cliff lane at her utmost speed, kept the lovers in sight some time, but could not overtake them, for they seemed to glide down the rocky pathway leading to Parguara, as if borne on the wind, till they disappeared in the glen. At the fisherman's door, however, she again caught a glimpse of them passing over the rocks towards a boat which floated off in the cove. She then ran out upon the howe, as the high ground projecting into the cove is called, just in time to see them on a large flat rock beside the boat, when a fog rolling in over the sea shrouded them from her view. She hailed them, but heard no reply. In a few minutes the mist had cleared away. Bright moonlight again shone on the water, but the boat and the lovers had disappeared. And then she heard mermaids singing a low, sweet melody, and saw many of them sporting on the water under Hella. That was nothing new, however, for the rocks and the sondes, the caverns, bordering this headland were always noted as a favourite resort of these death-boding sirens, whose wild, unearthly strains were wont before tempest to be heard resounding along pen with the shores. By daybreaking, the old fisherman came to Roskestel, and he told the farmer that he hoped to find his son there, for about midnight he saw him at his bedside looking ghastly pale. He stayed but a moment and merely said, "Farewell, father and mother, for I am come for my bride, and I must hasten away." And then when he had vanished like a spirit, it all seemed to the old man an uncertain dream. He didn't know if it was his own son in the body or a token of his death. In the afternoon, ere they had ceased wandering and making a search for Nancy, a young mariner came to the fisherman's dwelling and told him that he was a chief officer of his son's ship, and then at the mount with a rich cargo from the Indies bound for another port, but put in there because his son, her captain, went off Parguara, where he intended to land last night. Eager to see his native place, went aloft, and the ship rolling, he missed his holdfast of the shrouds, fell overboard, and sunk before she could be brought to or any assistance rendered. All then knew that William's ghost had taken Nancy to a phantom boat, and a watery grave was a lover's bridal bed. And thus their rash vows of constancy, even in death, were fulfilled, and their sad story, for a time, caused Pargwara be known as the Sweetheart's Cove. All right, then, and as the sun rises, a few short tales to round out the session. Mermaids in the Hooper. Within easy memory, many parts of the western coast were said to be frequented by mermaids, particularly Sennen Cove. This place was also resorted to by a remarkable spirit called the Hooper, from the hooting sounds which it was accustomed to make. In old time, according to tradition, a compact cloud of mist often came in from oversea, when the weather was by no means foggy, and rested on the rocks called Cowrow, and then to spread itself like a curtain of cloud quite across Sennen Cove. By night, a dull light was mostly seen amidst the vapor, with sparks ascending as if a fire burned within it. At the same time, whooping sounds were heard from proceeding therefrom. People believed the misty cloud shrouded a spirit, which came to forewarn them of approaching storms, and that those who attempted to put to sea felt an invisible force, seemingly in the mist, to resist them, much like a completely transparent prim 64 meters in a side. A reckless fisherman and his son, however, disregarding the token, launched their boat and beat through the fog with a threshel, and they passed the cloud of mist which followed them, and neither the men nor the Hooper were ever more seen in Sennen Cove. A ghostly ship's bell. Perhaps I just said one of those strange sculptures that's all solid, you can hardly see, it doesn't let you walk by it. In the southern side of St. Leven churchyard, there's a low altar tomb on the grave of Captain Wetherell, whose ship sprung a leak and sunk, and was drowned near Rundle Stone many years ago. This grave is regarded with fear and wonder by many persons in that neighbourhood, for ever since the captain was laid there, it has been believed that a ghostly bell strikes the hours and half-hours in his grave, the same as on board ship. 'Tis said this sound beneath the sod may be heard the clearest by persons passing the churchyard at midnight. Now it was a few minutes before that hour when the captain, finding his vessel sinking, made his crew take to the boat, but he himself refused to quit the ship, and as she went down, they heard him give 8 loud and distinct strokes on the bell. Many years since, several young people were assembled in the churchyard one Sunday forenoon. After services had commenced and the elders had gone into church, time passed pleasantly with the young folks in chatting about such occurrences of the St. Leven world as interested them. In rambling among the graves to look at the many garden flowers that bloomed on them, they approached Captain Wetherell's tomb, and a girl who stood by it reading the inscription started back on hearing a hollow sound beneath her feet. She and the others near her, who saw her emotion, listened, and lo, a ringing came up as a bell at sea. All rushed into church in a great fright. There was much talk of the strange occurrence for a few weeks, and less loitering of the youngsters to gossip in the churchyard during service. Shortly after, a young sailor belonging to St. Leven, who had been absent many years, came home for a few weeks, being in the Elder Tree public house one forenoon with some of his former companions. Their discourse led to the mention of the ship's bell sounding in Captain Wetherell's grave. The young seaman said he believed this story was all nonsense, and though strange or stranger things sometimes happen in old vessels, but as it was then near upon 12 o'clock, for curiosity's sake, he went out and he stood near the captain's tomb, whilst his comrades remained by the church porch for a few minutes watching the sundial. As it marked noon, the sailor rushed back to his companions, looking as pale as a corpse, and said with bated breath, "I truth I'm alive, I heard 8 bells struck on the grave, and wouldn't go near that spot again for all the world." And the young seaman, on his next voyage, found his own grave in the deep. And I never heard of any other person who went purposely to hear the captain's bell, for it's a general belief here that bad luck is sure to overtake those who endeavour to pry into ghostly doings that do not concern them. Let's see, how about the wreck of the Admiral Sir Cloudsley Shovel? We are reminded of the wreck of the Admiral Sir Cloudsley Shovel's ship, the Association at Sicily, of a tradition common to the islands which attributes to the disaster the reading or reciting of the 109th Psalm shortly before death by one of Sir Cloudsley's crew, whom he unjustly condemned to be hanged. The Admiral was returning with his fleet from Toulon when On the evening of 22nd of October, 1707, his ship struck on the Gilstone, about 3 miles and a half from St. Agnes, and in a few minutes afterwards she went down, and everybody on board perished except one man, who saved himself by floating on a piece of timber to a rock called Hellweathers, about 2 miles and a half from Gilstone, where he remained some days before the weather permitted any boat to approach and take him up to St. Agnes. Now, he is said to have stated that the day before the admiral's ship was wrecked, one of the crew, who was a native of Sicily and well acquainted with the channel, represented to Sir Cloudesley that the course the ship was taking would bring her on Sicily rocks. The admiral and his officers were incensed at the man's interference, because he persisted in affirming that the ship's way was wrong and would bring them to destruction. Sir Cloudesley Shovel, rather summarily one might now think, condemned that man to be hanged for insubordination, endeavoring to excite a mutiny. When the poor fellow was tied to the mast, preparatory to his being suspended by his neck from the yard arm, he begged as a last favour that a psalm might be read before his execution. His request being granted, he selected the 109th, and repeated certain imprecatory portions of it after the reader, and the last words he uttered were to the effect that Sir Cloudesley Shovel and those who saw him hanged would never reach the land alive. And so this poor wretch's body, shrouded in a hammock, with a shot to sink it, was cast into the deep, and but little heed paid to this dying sailor's sentence. Shortly after, however, the sky had been gloomy all day, much darker, black, lowering, hung over the fleet like a funeral pall, and the gale rose to a violent tempest, and then the hanged man's curse was dreaded, and lo, to the crew's consternation, they beheld his corpse, divested of his rude winding sheet, floating near the doomed ship, with it closely followed, with his face turned towards her in all her varying course through the eddying currents, until she struck on the Gilstone, when the hanged man went down with the ship and his messmates. At this unfortunate time there perished beside the admiral several officers, about 2,000 men belonging to then Association and other vessels of the fleet. Sir Cloudesley Shovel's body was washed ashore at Porthelick Bay and St. Mary's, about 8 miles from Oilstone. Now it was quite naked, and on the hatch of a ship on which he had endeavored to save himself, a little dog lay by him, when he was found by a soldier and his wife, who only knew him to be the admiral by a diamond ring on his finger. They buried him in the sand, where a pit on Porthelick bank still marks Sir Cloudesley Shovel's grave. Oddly, this pit never fills up in the greatest storms, and no grass ever grows on this blasted grave, although the ground around it is often green. And so the hanged seaman had as a sweet bit of revenge as one could wish for. I think we have time for one last tale of the wrecker and the death ship. Full well 'tis known adown the dale, those passing stranger indeed the tale, and doubtful may appear. Persons of a notoriously wicked character were said to have been frequently taken off bodily by old Nick when they died. Now this is one of the many stories to that effect. More than 100 years ago, a dark, strange man appeared in St. Just. No one knew whence he came, but it was supposed, however, that he was put ashore from a pirate ship by way of marooning him, as the crews of such are wont to do by any wretch that is too bad even to consort with them, the high sea robbers. This wretch didn't appear to want for money, as he soon rented a small lone tenement near the shore and married a widow of the neighbourhood. People wondered for a long while how so many vessels got wrecked under the cliff that bordered the stranger's farm. At length it was discovered that on dark winter nights, when honest folk were abed, he made it his practice to fasten a lantern to the neck of a horse, which he had hobbled by tying down its head to a foreleg. When he drove the horse near along the cliff, and the lantern from its motion would be taken for a vessel's stern light, you see. Now, consequently, on those on board ships sailing by, expecting to find plenty of sea room, would come right in and be wrecked on the rocks. Any of their crews that escaped a watery grave, the wretch would knock on the head with his axe, or cut off their hand when they tried to grasp the rock. He lived long, and became rich by his sins. At length, however, the time came for the fiend to claim his own. When he was dying, his awful shrieks were heard far away as he cried, "Do save me from evil, and the sailors there looking to tear me to pieces." Several parsons and other pious folk were sent for. All those of the neighbourhood readily came, for the dying sinner was rich. Though it was in harvest time and high day, the old wrecker's chamber became at times as dark as night. The parson saw the devil in the room, the devil himself, when others could not. By their reading, they drove him to take many shapes, but for all that he would not be put out. At last, when he took the form of a fly and buzzed about the dying wretch, they saw it was in vain for them to try any longer. During the time the exorcists were engaged, the chamber seemed, by the sound, to be filled with the sea splashed around the bed. Waves were heard as if surging and breaking against the house, though it was a good bit inland. Now, whilst this was taking place at the dying wrecker's bedside, two men who were about harvest work in one of his fields near the cliff heard a hollow voice as if coming from the sea, which said, "The hour is come, but the man is not come." Now, looking in the direction whence the words came, they saw no person, but far out to sea they beheld a black, heavy, square-rigged ship, with all sails set, coming fast in against wind and tide, and not a hand be seen aboard her. She came so close under the cliff that only her topmast could be seen, when black clouds that seemed to rise out of the deep gathered around her and extended thence straight to the dying man's dwellings. Now the harvestmen, terrified at the sight of this ship of doom, so near to them, ran up to the town place, such as the old sinner died, and when his dwelling shook as if about to fall, everybody in it, in great fright, rushed out and saw the black cloud roll off towards the death ship, which had once sailed away amidst a blaze of lightning far over sea and disappeared. The weather immediately cleared. Nothing unusual occurred until a few men assembled to put the wrecker's ghastly remains quickly off the face of the earth. And then, as the coffin was borne towards the churchyard, a large black pig came, no one knew from whence, and followed the bearers, all who declared the coffin was too light to contain any body. The sky, too, became suddenly overcast, and a tempest raged to the degree that they could scarcely keep on their legs to reach the churchyard stile, where such sheets of blinding lightning flashed around them that they dropped the coffin and rushed off into the churchyard. The storm having abated, they ventured out, and found nothing of the coffin but its handles and a few nails, for it had been set on fire and all else consumed by the lightning.